Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this panel on syndromic surveillance, the new frontier in privacy rights. As usual, we like to thank our sponsors, Hatch. And just as a matter of sort of housekeeping, channel all questions to us through Zoom on the Q&A button. And also, for those of you who are watching us on Facebook Live today, use the Facebook's comments to ask us questions. Karthika, who will actually funnel those questions to us, and will also kindly identify the person who's asked the question for the benefit of the panelists. And so what I'm encouraging everybody to do is to keep asking questions throughout the session today, and when appropriate, we will obviously get the panel to answer those questions for you. Because we have a panel of lawyers, especially today from across the world, we want to make sure that the information that this panel provides is not sort of legal advice. The disclaimers are written here at the bottom, and in no way should you constitute this as legal advice. If you have a legal issue, you should obviously retain your own counsel. The fine print is right there. Feel free to read that. So we just want to make sure that that is understood at the onset of this panel discussion. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead. I'm actually today Karthika is handling the questions and the tech from the back end. We have a guest co-host today who's Sanam Siddiqui. We'll introduce her in a bit. So we are essentially got Sanam to help us out because she's a lawyer, and Karthik and I was not about to go into the lion's den without backup. So Sanam is the legal mind who's going to help navigate us through the technology that is potentially going to be used in the future. And some of these insights and some of this information is coming from the previous panel we held on emerging technologies. So that is what is driving some of this technology concepts as well. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel. So the first person we want to introduce. Everything okay, Karthika?
Yeah, all good. Sorry.
The first slide, thank you. So, hi, Paul. Welcome. Paul's joining us from the US. He's a corporate attorney with a lot of experience, especially on the tech side. As you can see from his credentials, he's done a lot of work with various size companies and various types of technology. So we're looking for Paul to sort of provide us with some insights where the law meets technology, the nexus of that. So that's what we're going to lean on Paul for today. And then the next person we would like to introduce is Deepali. Hi, Deepali. Welcome to the panel.
Hi.
And I must say, I know you bring a lot of experience to the table. A very senior lawyer. One of the things that is striking about obviously your background is the fact that you work for two very large companies. One is Tata Steel, and the other one is Pfizer. So the pharmaceutical medical background from that kind of work would be useful, as would be large manufacturing, because some of the things we're going to talk about will impact large labor forces, factories, and manufacturing facilities. So we're going to draw on a little bit of that, in addition to all the other numerous experiences today, and the fact that you also both an attorney who's passed the New York bar as well as the New Delhi bar as well. So you've done the transition of working on the US side for many years as well as on the Indian side as well. So the next person we would like to introduce is Riyadh. And Riyadh's a very modest attorney. He keeps I had to really dig around to find information about him, but he's also done a lot of work for the government of Sri Lanka. He joins us from Sri Lanka. And he has done everything from sort of helped constitutional law stuff from Sri Lanka in terms of drafting constitution, law, vetting agreements between the government of Sri Lanka and other countries. So got a lot of experience in that area, in addition to all the commercial experience that he has. And he also is a barrister from Lincoln's Inn and also University of, attorney for the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka. So again, somebody with international experience and exposure. So we welcome all of them. And then, of course, our guest host today is Sanam Siddiqui. So Sanam is an industrialist, entrepreneur turned lawyer, very interesting sort of background there. So I think her first job was when she was 16 as a merchandiser. And at 21, she was running her own garment business with 200 people and ran a tannery, I think, with 1,000 employees. So she's been an industrialist. That's the background of her family as well. They're both major industrialists, both parents. And so she's sort of took to the law after, I guess, a conversation with the former solicitor of India, Mr. Harish Salve. So again, a lot of good experience there on various aspects of the law. And I'm glad to have her as guest host. Okay, so that's the introduction. And what we thought we'll do next is to sort of put a little definition up for what syndromic surveillance is, and Sanam will help me out a little bit as well. So interestingly, syndromic surveillance is when I first heard it, and I must confess, it was sort of a new term. I said, oh, this must be a new thing. But actually, it's quite an old thing. It's been around since 1970, I think, when the specter of bioterrorism sort of came into being. CDC and WHO and organizations like that started to put together ways to sort of see if an attack has happened. And the way to do that is to surveil or get to know what kind of syndromes people or symptoms and syndromes people were exhibiting. And that was reported up and then went through this whole chain of command. And people tried to find whether there were any sort of special clusters going on. And I think, Sanam, you had an interesting point that was it 2003 or something like that?
Yeah, so basically by May of 2003, health departments in the US had initiated syndromic surveillance systems in approximately 100 sites throughout the country. So it had already gained quite a bit of traction, 17 years ago.
Right. And I think what's really changed, the reason we are talking about this subject today, and that's why we wanted to put the definition up, is that I think as we've had these epidemics, and whether it's Ebola, MERS, SARS, unfortunately, we've had a lot of these things come by. Nothing in the same at the magnitude of what we're going through right now. But over the course of those years, as technology has sort of gone on a very exponential growth, and now we have a lot of technology. A lot of people are using mobile devices. So you have this kind of I guess convergence is the right word of a very serious pandemic with a highly virulent virus it's just sort of spreading across the globe. And then there's all this technology that's come around. And so these two are now meeting, and there's been a lot of sort of use of technology for syndromic surveillance. So the next thing that I would like to talk about is quickly, I think you all know Harari had a really good sort of explanation, I would say, or definition or quote. And he talks about this over the skin, that is sort of surveillance that's happening above you, and then under the skin surveillance, right? And he's obviously have some reservations about it. And he believes that we're at sort of a watershed moment in history where we're going to sort of, what we do today will sort of chart our course, at least his opinion, of what, human beings and surveillance, how that's going to pan out for the next, for the future. So he has some concerns. And I think those are the concerns I think our audience largely has as well. So the next thing I want to talk about is, this term that's sort of really been entered our lexicon, the word contact tracing. So synonymous with syndromic surveillance today, from a personal perspective of all of us, is this idea of contact tracing. And there's been a profusion of applications built, rather quickly by at least 25 countries. The MIT Technology Review does a real-time tracking of these tracing contact tracing apps, and there's 25 right now. And there's a recent economist article that was very useful. So there are a couple of dependencies. These apps are mobile apps. You should have smartphones, And if you look at on the left side, there's this sort of the penetration of mobile internet subscriber base in 2019, and you see that Europe leads as well as North America. So epidemiologists, say that in order to get good contact tracing done with this technology, it's useful to have around 60% of the people use that, of the population, right? So in Europe, where there's only 76% penetration of mobile internet subscriptions, 50% would mean all of those people get 60% would mean all of those people get online, and that's not really happening. And especially in the age population that's particularly hit, there is very, very less mobile internet penetration. In the US, people are saying, a recent survey, 50% of the Americans say, I'm not going to download a contact tracing application, right? So there are some issues in terms of sensitivity. I mean, if you had your phone in your pocket as opposed to having it in your hand, the number of false positives about how close you are to somebody. So there's some technological challenges that are not very apparent, and that is why you'll see in the next slide, countries like South Korea, in addition to phone, do credit cards and things like that, and standard sort of interviews to do proper contact tracing. Now, the emerging technologies, there's a company called Estimote, and they do beacons, and they were doing a lot of beacon technology way before this pandemic, but they've now come out with the capability to essentially, at a very, very high level of granularity. So they essentially install these sensors, beacons, inside, say, a factory, a school, office, right, to track how close, whether you're doing social distancing correctly, right? And it's a fine grain. So you get a lot more data here. And this is one option. I'm not saying it's going to be sort of a worldwide trend, but it is technology that says it's what I'm calling hyperlocal, workplace contact tracing. Yeah. So the next thing, next slide we want to talk about is, so companies like, in countries like Hong Kong, they've done this sort of wristband things. They're using this concept of you go around your home wearing this wristband and you calibrate your phone by just walking around all the rooms in your home. And that gives you a unique sort of signature of your home. And then if you leave your home, ostensibly with your cell phone, then immediately they'll know. So essentially, it's like putting one of those cuffs, on criminals. So essentially, if you leave and you're carrying your phone with you, then the government will immediately notify that you left your apartment and you've broken quarantine. And in Hong Kong, that could be a fine of up to $3,200, right? So there's this technology out there as well. And in the next slide, we'll sort of see, the sort of other technologies that have been used. So we have robots, we got cameras, we got drones. In China, they were putting this outside your doorway, sometimes inside your home. The government was doing this. And what was really interesting is to see the proliferation of these technologies. So in surveillance cameras in China, they estimate that to go up to 500 million almost next year. US is on track to do about 85 million. I think that number will change, especially if there is utility in putting more surveillance cameras for syndromic surveillance, right? Okay, so the next sort of point that we want to introduce is the under the skin stuff. So there's a lot of tech that we already use, like Fitbits and things like that, and Apple Health that already track, how we are sleeping, how much water we are drinking, how much walking, all of this stuff. These are all personal sort of information, very sort of individual information. Then you have things like the helmets in Dubai that use thermal technology to sort of see whether somebody has a fever, and then they also have facial recognition technology built into that. And that facial recognition technology is so advanced now, it can even recognize your face if you're wearing a mask, right? So these kinds of things are there. Aura rings, again, they're actually using that in a study in the US where frontline healthcare workers are wearing Aura rings because they believe that they can predict in advance of any tests when you might be getting COVID or getting sick. So these are all under the skin technologies, and this is where you will know Harari is feeling a little bad about, anxious or nervous, and I think all of us are too. So, okay, the questions I guess Sanam and I sort of want to post the panel in the beginning is, I think, for, 10 years, maybe the last 10 years, all of us have sort of ceded a lot of our privacy to companies like Facebook and Google, right? And we all know that, they're essentially watching and listening to, our wants and needs to service us better. And so my question and our Sam's question is, so why are we all so upset about the government trying to do the same thing? I mean, should we be concerned, and why should we be concerned? I guess is the question.
I mean, I guess the question is, our data is already out there. Government, private companies, tech companies already have access to our data. So where is it, and why is it a big deal if governments collect it?
Any thoughts from the panel?
Dipali, if I may ask?
Sure. So I think, thanks and hello everybody. So I think the first and the biggest concern that people have is, repetition of history. So I mean, it's true that syndromic electronic surveillance only started in 1970, but these are concepts that have basically, this was a process that went into personal ID, gathering and identification in the earlier part of the 20th century in Europe, and you have plenty of all that in terms of history. So I think the concern really is about manipulation of such data, right? And an understanding that perhaps the really underlying scheme that has to be maintained is about maybe the difference between democratic and non-democratic structures. So you don't want any autocratic or autocratic-like manipulations to be done in the hands of by government under the garb of doing something good. So I think if we go into looking at the cost and benefit analysis, there's been a lot of debate about this. You're right. There is an assumption that there is got to be something, but the underlying scheme I think is based upon two things, and that is about trust and transparency. And I think that's the overall standard that any scheme of such a proportion has to be looking at. So when I talk about trust, I mean, can the mechanism be trusted to collect the data for the intended purpose? Can it give it the legitimate use, legitimacy? Can it give it the protection? Can it not use it for incorrect things? So, you have examples even in the last 15 or 20 years, which Paul may touch a little more about, both in the US and UK, with the compass and all, and some of the data that was collected. So, history is not in favor of the fact of, or is a little circumspect about the gathering of information by government. So, the dual mechanism of trust and transparency is really what I think it makes the definition, or makes it questionable about, or makes us all a little concerned about the fact that governments want to collect data in the manner that they intend to do it, or have been doing it even in the recent few months.
So Paul, from a technology perspective, I think this quote also does a good job of sort of amplifying what Dipali just said, which is are they going to switch it off? Once they're in, are they in? I think that's I mean, we could look at the Patriot Act in the US. I mean, that was a response to 9/11, and things have changed. There hasn't been an attack since, but the act, I think, still is maintained, right, Paul?
The Patriot Act, providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. That's what Patriot. That's the acronym. And
right.
And you're absolutely right. I want to hit on some of those themes that Dipal hit on. We're okay with governments collecting information to help obstruct terrorism. That's okay. We're okay with most of us are okay with these private companies. They're public, but not government sponsored companies gathering information about us to maybe sell us more stuff, make it more convenient for us, market to us a little bit more. It's when a government or other party abuses that data and uses it for something that is nefarious. So she's absolutely right. Transparency is huge, and in the United States, Facebook was reprimanded harshly for allowing themselves to be manipulated by a foreign government in our government process. Imagine if the government in any of these countries allows this information to be used for, you know, their own political purposes. That's where we're all, or for even something more nefarious. And we look at history. We look at Europe in the 30s. If they had this sort of technology about and information about people and what you know forces that you know we now consider almost inconceivable in our
lifetimes,
our political world. But what if they had that type of information? It's scary, you know. And then if you peel back the onion and look at the information that Google and Facebook and some of these large companies have on us, it's, you know, it's scary. As long as they maintain that level of trust, where they're not going to disclose the information, they're going to use it anonymously, and they're just going to aggregate it to help in the greater good, you know, we're okay with that. But what do you do with all the data behind, you know, is it always anonymous? Is that all they're providing to the government? Is that all the government's collecting?
Yeah,
I mean, those are the questions.
It was an interesting point that you brought up Facebook, because we personally had an experience just today on that.
Talking about that.
We interestingly, right? So, you know, you've talked about, you know, obviously Facebook's been facing a lot of criticism around, you know, influencing elections and things like that. And so we've been trying to, you know, promote this this particular panel. We've always promoted all the panel, but this one on Facebook to reach a wide audience and let people know that we're doing this. And surprisingly, you know, first when Karthika was trying to boost it, as we call it in Facebook, they said, hold on a second, you need to provide a passport identification, because this is of a social, political nature. And if you're talking about issues of immigration, blah, 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 there's a whole list of those things, then you need to prove who you are as the provider of this content. So she was told to upload a passport, which she did. And then they came back, you know, several hours later saying, okay, that's not enough. You need to go get a police report, right? In the middle of a pandemic lockdown, right? So it's really interesting. So obviously they have that safeguard. I mean, obviously the criticism is coming from across the world saying, you know, you're manipulating elections, you're doing all these things. And so Facebook has now got this stand. So actually we were unable to promote this video, this whole session, because of that reason, right? Because of this title, I guess the word syndromic or surveillance or privacy or whatever, and rights, all those words sort of caught some algorithm and kicked it up to somebody who was a person looking at it, and then they went through all of these hoops. And obviously we couldn't actually promote this, pay money to promote it. So it was interesting.
You know, what's interesting, Lavi, is that yesterday Riyadh had said something about how law doesn't, you know, need to regulate every aspect of our lives. It's sometimes companies. Riyadh, would you mind telling all of us again who weren't in part of our private conversation yesterday?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we have different things that regulate each other. You have laws, and you know, you have various rules that have been set up by very powerful companies, and these are referred to as norms, something less than laws. And so the restrictions that Facebook imposed on you today is a restriction that is not imposed by law. It's a restriction imposed by a very powerful technological company that has literally a global monopoly in terms of social media. It's a very large user base. And if they tell you that you have to do something, it's not that you're compelled by law to do it, but in order to use that service, you need to do it. So, for example, if it's a train provider, if it's an airline, if they ask you to do certain things, it may be not required by law, but because of their monopoly as a service provider, if they tell you to do it, you have to comply with it. Just as the way you will comply, the same way that you comply with the law. So whether it's a law or a norm imposed by a powerful entity, you still have to comply with it. It's just that one is a law, one is a norm. The consequences would be different.
Right.
The consequence of not complying with the norm is that you'll be deprived of the service. which will impact you in some way. If you don't comply with the law, well, it could result in a criminal punishment or maybe a cancellation of a license. So the consequences could differ, but the obligation is still the same, that you still have to comply with it.
So you were using this example of Marks and Spencer, and I thought that was a very good one, which is, because of, I guess, child labor concerns and protests in the UK or wherever, they essentially mandated or told their manufacturers in Bangladesh and other places to adhere to a set of norms, as you're calling them. And so they were sort of compelled to do that, because if they didn't compel, then Marks and Spencer didn't buy from them. So essentially, they had to sort of follow these rules and regulations simply because Marks and Spencer had, was a large enough customer and they had to comply. That was the example that you were giving.
Yeah. I mean, you might have the labor laws in certain countries not meeting up to the required standards. They may not set standards for working hours. They may not set standards for working conditions. They may not set standards for pay. But irrespective of whether the labor laws in a particular country set those standards or not, because of consumer demand and consumer preferences in more developed countries, retail establishments in those developed countries try to meet those requirements of consumers. And those demands could be that they would want an ethically sourced product. These result in companies imposing those requirements back to back on the supply chain line. And then it results in countries, even if it's like, for example, in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka, having to follow a more stringent standard than that imposed by law. So it's another form of a norm that sets a higher standard than what the law requires you to do. It's quite a common form of governance that takes place. And so you look at Parliament as being one source of law. But likewise, you also have these powerful entities like airlines, Facebook, powerful retailers setting norms.
I have a personal example that maybe Dipali, you can also comment. I used to work in the insurance and reinsurance business a lot, and I was working with this underwriter, and he told me, he narrated the story where he and his family were traveling, and they just boarded the aircraft, and he was an expert on, I guess, the aircraft insurance, and he was actually boarding an aircraft run by the firm that his company was insuring. So as he was boarding the aircraft, he noticed something awry. And he told the stewardess as he boarded, "Can you please call your captain? I need to speak with him. It's very urgent." And she said, "No, sir, just go sit down. We're just about to take off. And, who are you to ask to see the captain," sort of thing. So she dismissed him. He said, "Look, I'm very serious. If you do not call the captain right now and I don't speak to him, I'll make one phone call and I will essentially stop insurance on your entire fleet of 737s because my company underwrites that. And I'm your chief underwriter. And I will pull the insurance on all of your 737s and the entire fleet. You will have no choice but to ground it because no airline or aircraft will fly without insurance." So Dipali, I think another institution, I think what we're talking about is liability, right? The impact of sort of liability insurance potentially on getting some of these surveillance technologies in from a liability perspective. I mean, maybe you can.
So absolutely. So, and I think that's the very important point here. So, there are two kinds of rules. One that you're talking about, which is the norm-based rules. But, I will argue and suggest that these are also evolving, either because of requirements under law in particular areas of the world, or, the way the courts or law enforcement has happened, and or part of what, all of us as lawyers love to do and think is that we can sort of predict which way we are going and sort of mitigate the risk. So, the fact that you are looking for ethical guidelines, or if Facebook is giving you all those directions, they're doing it to really limit the liability.
Right.
Then here's the second perspective, which is, really going back to why your original question, which is why do we have such a problem with the government collecting all this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So, there is a recognition of a couple more things, which is that in many countries and jurisdictions, the government has either issued rules, regulations, whether they're valid or not is yet to be, or will sort of beat the test of a court challenge or whatever it be. But they're requiring people to do certain things. So, for example, in India, currently, the population is obliged to actually download a government-based application. So, if you are if you're somebody who's traveling from point A to B, if you are actually coming out of lockdown and actually working in a space, you're going to have to do that. There is no element of choice. So I think that is where there is one concern. And look, I mean, I'm being rather pragmatic here too. I'm not saying that we're going to say that there is no ethic or conscience left in the world. I'd never believe that. But there has to be a recognition that, no matter all guidelines in the world, the best, legislated in law, because of guided by limitation of risk and liabilities, or for whatever reason, everything is not going to be able to answer every ethical issue. And I think that is a very, very important place that we have to start from. We have to understand that we are not going to get it all correct, right? So I go back to my theme of trust and transparency. It has to be a question of awareness. You have to know that it's a dynamic space. So, in all likelihood, people are doing these things or instituting contact tracing or, surveillance or whatever it be in whichever form. And it is dynamic and it's happening probably before formal rules and guidelines are coming into place.
So
that is so, like you said, that you have there may be global standards. So when it came to terrorism and air travel, their FAA enforced standards that pretty much every country followed. Do you think, Paul, do you think that the CDC can do something similar since it's already had a syndromic surveillance program?
The CDC, well, unfortunately, no. Is the short answer. I think the CDC has a significant influence, but they don't have the enforcement abilities that the FAA has, for instance. The CDC has had the national syndromic surveillance program for a while. I think, as you alluded to earlier, one of you, it originated out of, bioterrorism concerns. At least that part of the program, or the precursor to it. So I see them being able to issue certain guidelines, certainly, but the FAA has the power to actually, regulate an entire, industry, and the airline industry, and we're going to see the airline industry be a leader, I think, throughout the world on these types of surveillance tools. The monitoring people with looking for elevated body temperatures. Their booths with ultraviolet light that people they're potentially put everyone through. So I think you'll see that in the United States. So the CDC has a good level of influence, and the interplay with the World Health Organization, which is obviously a little strained right now. I don't see them as having as far a reach as the FAA did
after 9/11. So then who would
I just don't.
take the leadership then, Paul and Riyadh and Sanam and everybody else? I mean, who would take the leadership, or is leadership required? I mean, are these norms and rules or laws something that is indigenous to the countries of the jurisdictions? I mean, is there any sort of, can countries look to anyone or any person or any organization for guidelines on this? Or
is there even a global standard yet? Like you were saying, the CDC has a program, but is there any kind of global application to that or global standardization of that program?
Well, I think use of information in most countries, at least as far as the private sector is concerned, will be governed by some form of data protection law. And that would, to a large measure, govern how entities such as Google, Facebook, whatever the IT platform might be, would use private information belonging to individuals.
Right.
And the data protection laws in most countries would set out the principles that, I mean, the provisions themselves might be different in each country, but they would capture the core principles that are of importance for that particular country in terms of how they would want the data of a citizen to be used and retained, and for what purposes it could be used, and the legitimacy of its use and the length of its use. So there are so many principles that you might find in the data protection laws. Some of those data protection laws may apply to the government in as far as how the government might use the information. Some of them might exempt the government from data protection laws, particularly if the government uses its powers under certain other emergency laws which don't contain adequate data protection mechanism. But if that is the case, most countries around the world, not all, but most countries around the world have mechanisms for judicial review and judicial review of regulations as opposed to laws. And in some countries, you also have judicial review of laws themselves. So, and you have provisions such as the Equal Protection Clause in most countries, like in the US, Due Process Clause in India, in Sri Lanka, in the US. So these mechanisms of constitutional review of some of these laws or regulations are available in most territories. And using that, you could try and build in certain standards on the part of the government about the extent of data it collects, how it uses it, and its proper usage. And for example, the government might collect information from all of its citizens, but the fear is that is not about how the government uses information with all its citizens, but if it collects information, for example, concerning an opposition political party, you wouldn't want the government of the day being able to control opposition politicians using information collected during a pandemic.
Right.
Likewise, you wouldn't want the government using information collected to control the freedom of the press in its ability to disclose information against the government.
Right.
So, for example, the government might, in the course of doing surveillance about a pandemic, might pick up information about the movements of a journalist. And that journalist might be a journalist who has a lot of information about against the government, which he might want to publish in some form of media. But if the government manages to get a foothold of some private data about the journalist, which might compromise him, they could use that information to prevent him from disclosing information. So it violates the freedom of the press, as it's known in the US. It violates other constitutional liberties that are available in most other countries. And so that sort of usage of information is the one that is of high risk, and that sort of usage could potentially be controlled by form of judicial review litigation. But of course, that's also subject to the limitation of access to court. I mean, during lockdown, it's not easy to find lawyers, access court, and a lot of these violations of the law might actually take place, and then it might be a case of trying to litigate them down the line after the event has happened.
So is that consistent? Is that something you, and Paul as well? I mean, what are your thoughts on what Riyad is saying? I mean, I hear and understand what he's saying.
In fact, Paul, this actually, this is something similar to what you were talking about yesterday, the data for good.
Sure. There are any number of programs that companies have. That's Data for Good, I believe, is Facebook's program, and they all have them. Google has one Google has another one that uses Google Maps to show various trends in movement. Apple has, Apple has hundreds of maps that they can show you throughout the world. You can actually see them online where people over 60 live, based on the information they have from their phones and their so this information is definitely out there. And I honestly, and I think everything Riyad is saying is very important, and I think we all recognize that. And I think as good citizens of the world, we expect our governments not to abuse you know, the press or the other political party, the opposition parties that way. Not that they won't, but you know, we all hope that they won't. But you know, when you go back to standards, you know, global standards, we got to give the world a little bit of a break here. We've never faced anything like this in modern times. This is, you know, we've faced terrorism, we've faced wars, but a pandemic of this type is you know, once in a 100-year event, and so getting the standards right and across the entire world is. Are the governments going to be able to do it? Is the private sector, these private large multinational companies, going to do it? Is it going to be you know, a combination of the two working together? I think it's the latter. You know, these companies have this information. You know, the governments really have the responsibility to see that it's deployed appropriately and for the health of and good you know, for the benefit of of their citizens, right, and not to abuse it. So it's got to be a combination of these two, and we're seeing some of that. You know, there in some of the states in the United States, they're already deploying the contact tracing apps that are built on the Apple platform, on the Android platform, and so you know, and Google and Apple is going to deploy. They're going to put one out there.
But I think isn't there I mean, so I think what you're saying, Paul, and what Riyadh is saying, so there is some legal remedy sort of to rein in all of this stuff. And what Paul, you're saying is we're in the middle of a sort of unprecedented situation of a pandemic. Would it, I mean, the party, do you think it's sort of, okay, so in the next 2-3 months with the economies of the world sort of opening up and then the mandating that we have in India and other places, like, look, you're going to work, you know, we got to contact trace. We need to know where you are, what your temperature is. You know, have you been tested? Have you been eventually, if there is a vaccine, have you been vaccinated? So all of these sort of strictures would come down. There's a lot of this data now getting collected, as Riyadh was alluding to.
Well, but yeah, but I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah, this is interesting because this goes back to what we were talking about right in the beginning, right? That what is the big deal if governments collected and not private companies? Because by now we expected of private companies, they'll collect it and they will use that data to sell us things, you know, to sell us products. We are scared that governments will use this data to impose their agendas on us, not just sell them to us.
Right, true. But my question was, you know, I mean, yes, why we may have remedies and why we may emerge in a situation. Has the sort of horse already left the stable in a sense? I mean, if they collected all this data, you know, during this, you know, pandemic and lockdown, and even if we sort of go to court, I mean, would they go ahead and retroactively delete that data? I mean, can we trust the government to do that? Can we trust other people to do that? Or is this something, you know, we got to live with? I mean, this has happened and it's something we have to fine tune for the future.
So, I mean, one of the perspectives, while I agree with Paul and Riyadh that, you know, these are all locally legislated affairs. However, we must also build, you know, I think there are standards, globally acceptable standards, and we can use best practice. And even though, you know, it's true that these will get tested in our various courts of law, the reality is exactly about what you do. So, you know, there is a lot of analysis and work that has been going on, and particularly in the European Union, which is really the sort of center bed, I think, of privacy law and data protection laws in the world, and in evolved thinking. In fact, you know, I would like to share something that a good friend of mine, Professor Giovanni Comande, who's actually expert on the panel of the EU, and they had a report out just in February of 2020, not quite, I think, predicting the COVID situation. But, you know, I think there are important ideas there. So he talks about the fact that, you know, we have to move from a process of data protection to data management. And I think actually his words are quite prophetic, because that is the reality. This is what we are faced with. You know, we want to use a technology. We want to do what we need to. We need to create the data. We need all the facilities for very large populations, for moving populations, for complex things. You know, why shouldn't we have that advantage of the predictive basis of health and whatever else we are doing. But
Right.
really, if I start looking at it as that standard, so moving my mindset to data protection, to be tested on constitutional law principles, etc., post facto, etc., code bound to the basics. Talk about the data management. What is it that we can do? What is it that we will require, in my opinion? You will require something that is auditable. So, the transparency is very important. In technical terms, that means open source codes. There are issues around that about IPR and who can access, etc. Two, who's actually going to be sharing that data, right? So, in most countries in the world right now, as there is developing, I have looked at the US, India, and Europe currently. When I studied it, it's interesting. All the intended regulations actually have a rather wide term usage about who else they can share this data with. So it may be with other government agencies and bodies, but the reality is that, knowing how advanced AI is today and algorithms are today, the question is we also have to have a mechanism for actually getting all that information to be self-delete or not be used secondarily outside of it. The third thing, which is most important, and it seems to be a common thread all across, if you look at legislation and implementation anywhere in the world on this space, and that is, the voluntariness or the lack of thereof, right? So when it becomes imposed because you want to use a facility, we've already spoken some element about it. So
Right.
that's very important. And then the last, which is the most important, it's accountability. I think any rules and legislations, and I can definitely speak for the rules that have just been come out in India, the biggest challenge is if the government or the collecting agency, the state right now, is actually limiting its liability on the aggregation of that stuff. I think that is something that can be a universally acceptable standard. So wherever in the world we may be, these, yes, I think they have to be definitely monitored in some manner, developed in whatever our various jurisdictions and legislations are. But there's some learning and a lot of advanced thinking that has already happened on this subject.
So you're talking about accountability, transparency, and liability. So how does this affect a company in terms of liability? Will a company be held liable if its employee gets tested and is COVID positive?
So I think that's the big conundrum here. So in countries, I'm giving you an example just out of India, which is very topical. The Arogya Setu app, the contact, the syndromic surveillance tool, which the government came out with a while ago. The rules legislating it was only declared earlier this week. And the fundamental problem there is that, yes, there were these guidelines and regulations, indications to various people and users to use it and download it. Many people have done it, even those that weren't required, have done it just purely out of, I think, the limited understanding of what was to happen or not happen. The problem is, again, what is not clear and what is not known, and it's not even a question that 99.9% of the people who will be downloading that is going to ask, well, who is accountable for it? What is it that I'm actually agreeing to for the use? So there is nothing that is built in there. So what would a company typically do? In my mind, a company will have no option but to regulate this. They will have to, if that is the standard by which they must comply and come into the workspace, they're going to have to do it. But the problem then is, well, intended use maybe for a limited time period. How does it happen? Does it not happen? Have we limited, in fact, the information? Is the information still rudimentary? In certain countries, like in India, also many people actually don't have the smartphones. So, the hope is that they will be using some other kind of mechanism, which will be more aggregated and therefore will sort of put this sort of one step away from liability of the individual while everything is getting sorted and set.
So we have a couple of questions coming through. One from Dehraj Gupta. Welcome, Dehraj. I believe this question is for Paul. What if the private companies collecting our personal data share it with the governments. Not to forget that this is an ongoing debate across the globe against Facebook and Google for sharing data and helping governments with elections.
So the crux of the question is what if they share
the data? Yeah.
So okay, all the private companies in the United States and in Europe under the GDPR laws and the ones that are promulgating themselves across the United States through the various states require consent for collection of data and use of that data, and that you can have that data removed. So let's all remember that again in the very first part of our question. Why are we so readily giving our data to these private companies? We can always get that. We can always have that data removed. Yes. In all the privacy settings, you can ask now the private companies in the United States, I want mine removed, my personal information and my account deleted, and they're supposed to remove them. So when you say share our data with the government, right now, with contact tracing and the way that technology is proposed and is being implemented, is almost all of that data is anonymous. It's aggregated until that person enters the system, meaning they're the ones they're the ones who enter into the tracking app that I am positive, and then it sets off a chain reaction to notify everyone that they supposedly came in contact with that you've been in contact with someone who's been diagnosed positive with COVID, and then those people go, and that's how those apps work. So your personal information is not supposed to be shared with the government without a warrant or a court order, for a criminal investigation of something of that nature. So right now, I don't know of any proposal from the United States government or from any of the states or from any of these private companies to share private information with the government. Anonymous data, aggregated data, is something that I'm sure they're already they offer on their website. I mean, you can go on Data for Good, Facebook's Data for Good program, or Google's program that shows trends in population, and you can see your data at work anytime you want to on the internet.
Right.
So it's not a direct answer to the question, because I think the question was intended, what if they give my personal information to the government?
So that jurisdictionally, so the US has some, and I think maybe people in the world seem a little bit more sort of willing that Facebook and Google collect this, and I can, yes, delete it anytime and based on my privacy filters. But I think what Deepali was saying was pretty much that I don't think those safeguards exist in other parts of the world. Correct, Deepali? And I think there was a question.
Actually, there was a follow-up question as well, Deepali.
Yes.
Former Supreme Court judge has stated that mandating use of Arogya Setu app is illegal in India. Do you agree?
Okay, so I'll take the two questions. One is about whether Arogya Setu is illegal in India, and the statement by Justice Sri Krishna, which does decline it. So let me explain. I mean, I'm not the bench of the Supreme Court, but the reason perhaps that he made that statement is because of the fact of how those rules or how that direction to compulsorily download that, how it was actually legislated. So the standard is, well, it is not really formal part of law. Can you make it compulsory or not? And that is probably where the challenge lies. And that's probably why Justice Sri Krishna spoke what he did. The second question, I think, was the first question actually raised by Navi. And that was about, does it mean that, some areas of the world have this legislation and others don't? The answer is, I'm not sure about the fact that, or I'd like to believe that in some instances, at least in most instances, the principles of right of privacy, the right of life, the freedom of speech, at least in all democratic countries, constitutionally constructed countries, will find the fetters. So, even if you have in a country like India, which doesn't have a fully legislated data protection law yet, it's still in a bill form, the reality is that there are other, thankfully, checks and balances in the system. The problem, however, is what is happening right now. And that is what, from both the point of view of a human rights concern, as well as from even a corporate concern, will be, well, what is that standard which I can predict is likely to be the right thing to be doing? Yes, we can go to court, we can say that we are not going to use this information, but, something that Paul raised, very, very important, it's the element of informed consent. So, informed consent means that everybody who's actually using that understands exactly how and what they're able to do. And I think the question really is, do people really understand that? So will everybody in a population across the world, have access to that understanding? Secondly, if they do have access to that understanding, then are they actually able to exercise or be in a position right now where they can actually negotiate? So if tomorrow I wanted to come out of Facebook, so, self-confession, I'm not on Facebook, for example.
Right.
So if I wanted to get off Facebook, or I wanted to change my privacy or security, controls, can I do that easily? And that will be the standard and the test. And that's another point, it's about anonymity of information. What Paul talked about, that you can today, even on the web, anyway access all these indicators, the generalized generic information, which is anonymous, not linked with your name, but, can sort of give you demographic details, age profiling, etc., or whatever, interest levels or the marketing push that happens, etc. The question is that what I understand, I'm not a techie, but whatever I have understood is that it is also equally easy to, for the technical people to change that anonymity into, into specific data. Right. So, how do you put fetters around that? How do you contain that information? If you have to use it for that temporal time or period for the intended use, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, whatever it be, how easily are you going to be able to delete that information, or or change your privacy control right? And then finally, be assured that during the period that you are actually using this, no secondary data or algorithms are facilitating the use of secondary data from your link, whether it is through Bluetooth or any other contact tracing mechanism. So I think that is the big question, at least in my mind. And frankly, I don't know. I don't have an answer for it.
So actually, there's another question directed at Riyadh now. Do you feel that laws, whether privacy or data protection, are unable to keep pace with the fast pace of change in technology? Because technology has become a constant threat to privacy today.
The data protection laws in most countries across the world embody certain principles about how information that is held by a particular person, how much he can receive, how they can use it, at what point they should delete it, and for what purposes they could use it, and that sort of thing. So it would apply irrespective of the technology platform that is used. So it could apply to Facebook, it could apply to Google, it could apply to a database, it could, for example, apply to a blood bank, it could apply to a hospital that is collecting data. So it contains a set of principles that applies across the board, irrespective whether it's a technology company, irrespective whether it's completely offline. It could be a very remote entity in a remote part of the country which doesn't have any access to internet at all, but the data protection laws of the country would still apply to it. So the data protection laws generally have stood the test of time. It's possible that technology may evolve where some of the terminology is used or some of the concepts used in the laws may not be as useful as it was at the time it was enacted. So you may need to refine the terminology, but I think the broad principles that are captured in most data protection laws are adequate, despite the changes in technology that may occur from time to time. That said, I just want to make a comment on some of the issues that were discussed earlier.
Sure.
I don't think social media institutions like Facebook and Google can freely share information with the government, because there are two limitations to that. The first limitation is entities such as Google and Facebook would be subject to data protection laws in countries where the data protection laws exist. In countries where data protection laws don't exist, arguably, there could be either a contract, express or implied, which limits their ability to share information that are held by them with governmental institutions. So, to the extent that entities such as Google, Facebook, or any other social media attempts to share information that you have in contravention of those laws, either statutory laws like data protection laws or common law principles like contract law, you might be able to seek appropriate remedies in respect of that. Insofar as the government is concerned, the government also equally doesn't have a right to collect all information about everyone for all purposes from institutions such as Google and Facebook. They need to act within the framework of laws that have been enacted. And there are specific laws for specific purposes. For example, you might have terrorism laws that allow governments to access information for the purpose of abating, preventing terrorism acts. It doesn't mean that you can collect all the information about everyone and use it for any purpose. So in the context of the pandemic, the government might, if there is appropriate legislation enacted, and I think some governments must be scrambling to do that, some may be already having legislation in place. Within the scope of the legislation, you might be able to collect data, but not all data, but the data that is allowed to be collected for the limited purpose for which you are allowed to collect it. So I don't think it's an open-ended license for either the social media organization to share data, and I think it's equally not an open-ended license for the government to take all the data. So I think there are legal regimes that apply to different entities, and depending on the territory where you live in, that balance has to be struck. And so I think the probability of an entity such as Facebook or Google sharing all the information that it has is quite remote. And I think the ability of the government to collect all such information is also remote. It all depends on the laws and the purposes of which you can collect it and use it.
So I think that is a very sort of reassuring tone that Riyadh, Paul, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, let's also understand that Riyadh is absolutely right. The Google, Twitter, Apple, Amazon's, Microsoft, Facebooks of the world are a different set of data. I mean, they overlap, but they're sometimes a different set of data than what, let's say, the CDC collects. The CDC collects from emergency rooms, from urgent care centers, from insurance companies, and then the insurance companies have a whole other set of data. So this syndromic surveillance is there are different aspects to it, and there's different data for each aspect of it. Contact tracing is just tracking humans, and then identifying, and then after that, the surveillance that needs to be done is more of a medical nature, and so they're actually it's a confluence of a lot of different data from a lot of different providers of this data or aggregators of this data. So it's not so when the question comes in, are they going to share it with it? What does the government want? The government doesn't want all of it because the government's not selling you widgets. The government may want some information about about tracking you for contact tracing purposes. So it's a very complex question.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is, though, I mean, as a technologist on the panel, sort of, what I'm seeing a trend in the future is, I mean, there are so much benefits that can accrue from what we are calling under the skin surveillance, right? So this could be, I mean, under the right regime or structure, right? This stuff is actually quite good because, I mean, think about where we are today, right? I mean, I just want to, for the benefit of the audience and the panelists, so if we had a very egalitarian, well sort of protected syndromic surveillance, and we had a pandemic occur in a part of the world, right? Because of the technology we had, we would be able to easily sort of know when it happens, right? We would then know who's got it because we have contact tracing as a sort of a standard operating procedure across the world. We could turn it on and say, okay, there's a pandemic or there's some trigger. And then, we look at the contact tracing, we find out the people that person or persons have interacted with, we isolate them, we quarantine them. There's proper technology, so we know that people are not easily breaking quarantine, and we nip the pandemic in the bud. And that way, essentially, you don't have this kind of global meltdown we are currently having. So people are sort of, I think, if you ask the average layperson, hey, look, if you have this kind of early warning, and I think Dipali hit the nail on the hammer with the professor's quote. I mean, it's about data management as opposed to protection, right? So if you had the capability to manage this in a holistic, sort of transparent, accountable, trustworthy manner, if I was to use those sort of words, Dipali, that you were mentioning, and others on the panel, if you were to do that, I think people wouldn't have such a lot of anxiety about the surveillance. In fact, if you ask me, hey, look, if you were making a compromise between your health and safety and privacy, are you willing to consider a little bit of this only in certain parameters? If there is a pandemic or epidemic or some kind of outbreak, right, of the flu maybe, or something that looks like a potential to be a deadly disease, that these things sort of get activated, and people's tracking of movements are now made available to government agencies, to health ministries, right, of the country, and out to CDC, WHO, right, so that they can start look at this thing in a sort of a technologically savvy way, right, with all of the disposal of the technology that is being created. Now, remember, the same technology, this data that's creating, is also being used to fight this pandemic in terms of a cure, right? So all these data sets that is out there now, in our previous panel, we found out is being used for sort of predictive sort of things that while you were talking about, like how can we predict? We can take this great data. I mean, the data is agnostic, really. It's the people and institutions that sort of make it autocratic or democratic, right? So the technology exists. If you apply the right sort of modus operandi on that data, then you can derive a lot of human benefit, right? I mean, from the standpoint of public health, and also from economic sort of, making sure the economies of the world are not impacted. So we can be a lot more surgical in our application, right? Instead of shutting down all travel in the world and, ending the tourism industry and, putting supply chains at risk, you can say, okay, like, here it's happening, we're tracking, we know everything that's going on, we're isolating, we know that people are not jumping aircraft and going and spreading it into, 7 corners of the world. I mean, I'm just putting this out there. I think that's what people want. I mean, the government just sort of wholesale doing this is a problematic thing. But are we at this point where, technology is sort of at this point where we can't be afraid of it? There has to be some kind of syndromic surveillance. And I'm hearing from Riyadh and everybody else that the law does allow for some of this stuff. It'll catch up if it's behind. But maybe what we're talking about is sort of putting some of these in place. I mean, okay, the pandemic.
Wait, hold on. There's a question for Paul. There is an impending debate that using Zoom for webinars and VCs is not video conferences is not safe for various reasons, including that while on video conference Zoom is recording. I understand that there is no concrete proof, but what if?
I didn't hear the last part.
Okay, so essentially what Dheeraj Gupta is saying is, because Zoom is recording, whilst there's no concrete proof, what if?
Why is there no?
While there is no concrete proof, even Zoom
I guess the question is there a problem in Zoom recording images?
Yeah. Like, surveillance.
Yeah. Oh, so it's for so Zoom, if Zoom is recording everything that everyone is saying, other than using the recording device, the aspect of the application, then obviously it's violating not only its terms of use, but multiple laws of the United States. And that that data would reside somewhere, and there would be penalties for that. Obviously, at some point, it is, and so I don't think anyone can say absolutely that it isn't being recorded somewhere, at least temporarily, and that's just the nature of the way servers work. And Lobby can speak to that much more succinctly than I can. But if is there a data farm somewhere in Ashburn, Virginia, where all of the Zoom conferences are stored? I highly doubt it, just because of the consequences of doing so, basically illicitly. The consequences that could be imposed upon them, would ruin the company. I mean, so I don't see that as a threat. I do see it as a threat that someone could access their systems and are recording or downloading the stream itself and recording it somewhere and used for nefarious purposes. But that would be a third party hacking situation. I don't think the company, I believe it's a public company here in the United States, could survive, the disclosure of such a,
Right.
egregious breach of trust and the law. So I just don't see it, but anything is possible.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many videos also, right? Everybody else is sort of putting on Facebook Live and everything else. I mean, video is like text in 15, 20 years ago. There's so much of it now. And
I can tell you one thing: this one's being recorded because I could see it being recorded.
Well, what's interesting also about Zoom is that it seems that the software that's been developed has been developed by 3 companies in China.
Well, that may be the real question.
Which is what apparently also makes, of course, US authorities nervous today.
Just like Huawei's 5G, I guess. So I think, okay, I mean, just to wrap up, I think we're at sort of the hour time frame, so I don't want to indulge the panel too much unless there's something the panel wants to actually hash out that we haven't covered. In which case, please jump in. But I think I hope we've sort of shed a little light. Actually, I found it reassuring to hear from the lawyers about this, because I think I didn't quite understand, and I'm sure lots of other lay people in the audience will probably also be hopefully reassured that yes, there are actually lots, even in countries where there are no implicit or explicit data protection laws, or they're in bill form, that there are other laws that I think Riyadh was pointing to that we could draw on in a case where we feel that our privacy is being violated by the government, or in this case, which seemed to be the culprit of the hour. And at the same time, I think all of us, I mean, given the poll that we held earlier, are somewhat sort of in the mode that, no, look, there's an unprecedented situation. Look, I am happy to sort of download this app if it means that I can go to work, and when I do go to work, if there is somebody who falls ill, they can quickly figure out who it was that they talked to. So the whole office doesn't have to be quarantined, right? They can pick who this person actually met on any given date or time. So they could sort of be more effective or more selective about who they put into isolation. I think that's reassuring. It doesn't mean that, I go to a building of 3,000 people working there, and then somebody coughs and comes down with COVID, and all 3,000 people have to now go into quarantine. That's not very scalable. And certainly, sorry, there was a point, Deepali?
Yeah. I just wanted to add one thing. The utility of this is great, but there is one little small element, and I think we've not covered that right now.
Okay.
And that is our own expectation from that model. So, as Paul had touched in, most of these contact tracing applications in the world right now are based upon voluntary disclosure of information by individuals. So, so I know, like, for example, in the Indian app form, you have to, you fill in a survey sheet which gives all your indications of, symptoms, etc.
Sure.
And then there is a little bit of either the affirmation of, whether you have it or not. And then, so it's all based upon my voluntary, sort of upload of that information.
Right.
And we have to recognize that if I was a user, which was not being mandated to use this by law or by to actually go into workspace, etc., and do all this. And there are a lot of people, 90 million people have ostensibly downloaded this in India out of a population of 1.3 billion. So that's a substantial number of people in India, for example. Right. The reality is, if I have done it with the expectation that I'm going to see every single person that may potentially have this, may not be accurate.
That's
so
correct.
It's a flip situation, so I just thought I'd throw that in.
Actually,
because that's true.
It's a very pertinent point, because the Economist article points this out, right? To epidemiologists themselves say 60% of the population. So in 1.3 billion, 60% is not 90 million. It's a lot bigger number. So yeah, for it to be actually effective to be done with an app, you got to get at least 60% coverage. That's what epidemiology, I'm not having luck with that word today, is saying. So yes, I think in a country like India, I think only countries, Europe, China, and the US, I think we saw from that graph, that have enough smartphone penetration that this could actually work in. So and maybe, small countries like Singapore and places like that, right? Or Korea, South Korea, there are countries like that would work, but India, and I don't know what the Sri Lankan number is, but so those are the countries that would benefit from an app. The other countries, you're right, will not benefit from it, right? So I think I think, as I was saying earlier, I think it's reassuring that there are some of these laws, and I think there was a point that I think maybe we haven't explored fully in this panel, and that was the sort of the powers, this concept of norms that Riyadh brought to bear. And I think a lot of these normative sort of things will probably have a bigger say in our, change behavior, and whether that's from insurance companies or employers, saying, hey, look, if you're coming to work, you got to have the app downloaded. I got to take your temperature. Maybe I go a step further and I install thermal cameras everywhere, so it's real-time monitoring. Because you can walk in with no temperature, 2 hours later you could get a fever. Right, so they may be compelled to do all of this surveillance technology sort of presumptively because the insurance company wants it, or they want to feel that their customers will want to know whether it's a place where there's a lot of customer contact, like a retail environment, like a mall or a grocery store. Maybe they want to make sure that their employees are constantly monitored. So if you shop here, you're safe. This is just business practice. Taking things to a net level, and if you want to work there, you may have to sign a consent form that says essentially you got to agree to that, and there'll be not much you can do about something like that. Like the Marks and Spencer example, right? So I think these are things that may evolve. I think post this lockdown, as we start to open up, companies may want to cover their backs from potential litigation. And I think, Paul, you were mentioning that you are anticipating a lot of litigation in the US from against health insurance companies around coverage in terms of who's paying the bill for the treatment that's happening. I'm sure, Dipali, you're getting calls all throughout the night and day. I know you guys are really busy, so I know this is the case, from lots of companies asking about, how, if you open up this whole thing that Sanam was so rightly pointing out. Yes, we open our doors, tell people to come to work because the government is telling us now you got to start business and get the economy started. But what happens if somebody, gets COVID from somebody else and they die? Are they going to hold the company liable or accountable, or are they going to hold the government accountable? Where does that fall? So I think these are still unresolved, and we are probably not going to get it resolved in this panel either. But I just wanted to thank everybody for sort of joining this panel. Unfortunately, Sonia couldn't be with us because she had a family emergency. So we're going to have a one-on-one with her post this panel and hear what the Hershey Corporation in the US may be doing on this subject. So I want to thank our panelists again and Hatch for sponsoring the event. I just want to let our audience also know that I have a great interview coming up with Dr. Sandhya Sriram, She's the CEO of a company called Shiok Meats in Singapore. And they're actually making they're making shrimp. It's actual shrimp, but no shrimp are dying, or there's no shrimp farms or shrimp fishing involved. So they're doing, so it's a 100% vegan crabs, lobster, and shrimp technology. So you will have all of those things. And they're well-funded startup, and they're in R&D right now, and soon to come up with the product that essentially is actually shrimp. It's not a mock meat or a plant-based version of it. It's actually shrimp. So using the cells and DNA of shrimp and crabs and lobster. So this is sort of the new thing, sort of the zero carbon footprint food revolution things that we're talking about, putting the planet on a pandemic diet so that we don't have these zoonotic diseases like what we're having, destroy us as well as the planet. Yeah. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us, and have a great weekend, and Paul, for you the rest of the day on a Friday. Thank you for joining us from the US, Mumbai, Colombo, and Delhi, and Karthika as well. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Welcome. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.